This session of Keenan Architecture is the second half of Le Corbusier. We've drawn the Villa Savoy, which is obviously his most formidable piece of modern architecture in terms of the pure sort of utilitarian sense. This is going to be much more primitive and sculptural. It's the church, which is most often referred to as Ronchamp because that's the city it's in, but its actual name is Notre du Haut, which is Our Lady of the Heights from 1955. And it's a spectacle of the 20th century because it ends up being, again, more primitive and sculptural than his typical Le Corbusian rational functionalism. Because at this point, he was trying to replace a pilgrimage chapel destroyed during World War II. So imagine a medieval church on height here. It's got a commanding view of the local hills and mountains in the distance, and destroyed by a Nazi air raid. So the rubble on the site, in order to keep costs low, are actually still existing in the building. So Corbu used the materials left in the ruin to build the actual formation of the walls themselves, and then skim coated those in concrete. The reformers within the church at the time looked to renew its spirit by embracing modern art. And here we have a great piece of modern art, although it's a different type of phase that Corbu kind of went through post-World War II. Is obviously the first World War II generated the modern movement in terms of a platform for it, coming back from that kind of atrocity. And then the Second World War II also changed the culture and the language of architecture as well. So again, the modern master Le Corbusier, originally Charles Jeneret from Switzerland, changed his name formally to Le Corbusier as an object type and practiced well into his 70s. Structure is mostly built of concrete and stone. So we're going to draw it from this view, as you see in the model here. It's actually, it looks like a very large building. In fact, the walls are so thick and so deep, it's actually a very small church chapel on the inside. It's got because it's got a commanding hillside view at a purposeful hill as you approach it, almost like you're walking up to the Parthenon in Athens. You don't really see the church until you've risen to the top of the hill itself. So it rises out to a point on the east end and expands up to 10 feet thick on its west end and curves down towards the south. So we won't be able to see the interior in this model, and maybe later on we'll draw the interior at some point, but for now we'll draw it from this view, which is kind of the quintessential view where you see sort of the projection of the forms kind of moving in three-dimensional space. So nothing is purely orthogonal, although he did design the generation of the floor plan to work within the golden section in terms of sizes. He moves the vertical elements in planar movements across three axes. So the opening of the church is kind of rushing out towards this point here, like a prow. So you see sort of the sectional view of it rising up from the north to the south here. So that's kind of the view we like to draw to shape the church here. So use that as a reference from time to time. And so this will be a fairly simple one because it's very monolithic. The white concrete skin on top of the stone rubble is very monochromatic. The plane of grass is simply a lawn of green. There's a little bit of vegetation drawn to behind it on the left and the right, and the rest is just sky above it. So we'll start with the building itself, and then we'll bring in those tones and values later for the composition of nature around Ronchamp. So the first thing we'll do is since we've got this pre-lined out, is establish how we're going to work with light, shade, and shadow. So the first we're going to do is recognize that the sun is strongest on the left edge here. It gets caught by the roof line and casts a nice significant shadow for us here, keeping the whole right side in shade. So the first we're going to do is sort of make a nice splashy pool of a darker tone of black and gray and blue. So make sure there's plenty of water. This is, we're going to cover a lot of area with it. It'll even switch to the medium blunt to get more water moving into this. And kind of build that out with the blues and blacks we've done before for shade and shadow. We want to make this a little bit darker with the blacks because the roof line itself is a darker gray black type of concrete. We want to start very, very sort of wet on dry, so it's not a heavy paint type of wash we'll put in, but more of a water wash that's toned to be that tone. Maybe pick up some past green in there to mute it out a bit. And so since that is of color up there, whether light hits it or not, we're simply going to treat both sides of here. Some people see it as sort of the prow, the nunnery habit back then, which would have had sort of a flying pitch to the hat that nuns would have worn in France at the time. Maybe that's a kind of a image that Corbu had in the back of his mind. And then we'll test this like we always test to make sure it's what we're looking for here. Again, it's monochromatic, so we're not looking for a lot of color. Let's see, where's my base sheet? So that wash we're looking for is somewhere in this zone. So when it hits, it's again that sort of off blue-black tone. And then when we add shade or shadow to it, it'll go deeper and a bit more blue to connect with the sky. But that'll be sort of the base tone we'll give for all the concrete to start out with on the roof level. So very quickly, as long as you've got enough water in the pool over here, you don't want to ever sort of short it out when you're doing a big wash. Simply come up and hit the concrete quickly along here. The formwork is actually still expressed. It's not as if it was groomed out to be terribly monolithic, so don't worry about the wash settling differently. It's got a second kind of texture to it from the formwork for the concrete pour for this piece. And then it comes out to sort of the prow here. And then we have the opposite side coming down to the right. Now, if you wanted something that was much more monolithic and less about the strokes between our hand involved in moving it, we could have made this a water wash first and then drop the color into it. That would make it a bit more monolithic. But having a little bit of texture here kind of shows the manual quality of rebuilding this church on the site. So that's zone one. It's going to take a while to set up, so we can simply come down and drop down to zone two, opposite down here, the whole hill that it sits on. And again, it's just the crown of a hill that kind of rolls up, and the apex of it is where the old church, the medieval church was. So I have a little bit of residual green from the past work, and so we're going to add to that to build a nice warmer green at the base, because it gets a lot of southern western exposure through the day. And again, it's a big area, so we need plenty of water. We'll bring in some of the blues we're going to use for the sky later to kind of mellow that out a bit. And again, it's a long space of paper stock here, watercolor paper, so I want to make sure there's plenty of water in the pool we're going to work from. And then we'll give that a test over here. That may be a little bit too brilliant, so I'm going to cut it down a bit. Adding a little bit of red to it. And red and green kind of wash out into more of a brown or ochre type of green. That'll settle it down. So you can see the difference a little bit here. It's a little bit warmer now, and that's probably a better stock for us in the drawing. So then again, working very quickly here, just make sure it's very splashy type of wash and just go left to right all the way across the paper. Several times here. You can see this media really allows for a lot of coverage very quickly. And then where we're standing in terms of the view here, we're further down the hill. So the grass closest to us is going to be more brilliant. And so the grass that rolls up and around to the crowd heads back has got a little bit more of a sense of the color. So come back at the top here and just re-stroke that in at the very tip. And then load up the brush one more time and do that one more time as well. To get more pigment to show the movement of the hill going up and away from us. And it stops, obviously, when it comes to the dry paper there. You could probably even stroke some horizontals in here now, too. There's our placeholder for the base of this. And now we'll do a quick little place of what we're going to do for the vegetation, which is in the backdrop here. And right about where this, if you swing this out beyond the tower over here to this point, that's kind of the height of the background trees. And they come all the way down to grade over here. On this side, it's a little bit shorter because it's further in the distance. The hill kind of wraps around, the vegetation is angling away. So it's from this side and then down toward this edge. So now we can come back to the green and maybe change brushes since it's a smaller area. And we want to have them be more of a blue-green in the background because all colors kind of turn a mix of blue. The deeper they go away, sort of purple mountain majesty or mountains in the distance are so far away, they're never really purple when you get there. But the sky blue above coats the colors and changes colors in the distance. So we want this to be a little more transparent, but deeper in kind of a blue-green in the backdrop. And that'll have this sort of its forested view for us. So we'll check out that blue-green really quickly here. You can see it's a little bit cooler than our grass green. And we have a smaller area for it. And now it's vegetation, so it's got more of a range. So we'll start with the preliminary coat. It's over here on the right. And that gives a nice edge against our white building. We just fill that up, coming right down to the grade. And the same thing over here on the back side. Be careful because that edge is very important to us to hold that. So we're really sort of drawing with the paintbrush at this point. And because you're doing wet on dry, it stays wherever you put it. And then down to the grade. So that's just sort of a base determination of that value to give a little sense of the end of our sketch going on the back side of it. And now with this one setting up here, almost dry, we can come back and do a wash for the sky. So what we're going to do here is a little bit different wash because we have a real simple blue sky behind it. We want that to have a darker tone against our whites. So we're simply going to take a clean brush and we're going to just put water on this whole space. But before we do that, we're going to prepare the blue we want to put in there because we've got a big area to cover. So we're going to come back to a fresh pool of water since we have green in one of my cups now. Go to a clean cup and come back to the blues area and start to build in the color sky you want behind here. And we might even add some white to it to make it sort of a milkier blue. Powder blue there. And we'll try it against our colors we have so far. Make sure it's really wet and watery. So that seems like it might be a nice sky blue behind it. And what'll happen is it'll be really strong here when I'm just doing the small area. But the water we have on here, it'll be sort of a wet on wet wash. We'll sort of make it more ethereal and kind of push it around the water. And we'll just see what the water and paper gives us the first time we add the pigment to the paper. So now use your larger brush just to make the time more shortened. And start at the top and just go left to right and add paint drop to paper. Now it'll buckle it up because you're putting water across the whole paper here. Then it'll settle back down a little bit. Just do this as fast as you can. In the beginning, it's just sort of on the surface of the paper, and then eventually the water opens up the fibers of the paper and in fact stretches the paper out a bit. It's more like if you really, for instance, if you do a really huge wash in a big piece of paper, sometimes you can take it into a sink or a basin or even a bathtub and just dunk the whole paper in there. And then you bring it back to a piece of wood and staple it to it. So the paper is going to stretch out, kind of not so the human eye can see, but certainly the paper is working that way. The fibers are becoming fat with water. And as it dries, it becomes taut and goes back to its form. So if you staple it down at the corners, it'll stretch the paper out for really long, big washes. We'll just do this as a sketch kind of by hand without drying the paper down. But it's probably happened to yours as well that the paper's starting to bubble a bit. And that's okay because we're simply doing a sky. Now we take it around this side of it. Keeping our tower nice and white. Hold that edge. Because now your next pigment play is only going to go where the water is. So go right around the tower here. Define that corner really well. And just work water right up to that edge. Okay, now again, you're racing against the clock because if you take too much time on this, then parts of this will dry before the rest. You want it all equally wet about the same amount of time. So move quickly from this to our blue base here. So get the brush really sloppy with the paint. Simply cover up. And I'll just move that pigment around here and let the water do the work. Now, in the first minute here, you're just sort of placing it and it's sort of sitting in the water and trying to bond with the fibers. So now another step you can do when you're doing washes like this, which we haven't attempted yet because we haven't done sort of a full sky like this yet, is now use gravity as a tool. Let you get all the pigment in. And gravity would work by taking your sheet of paper now and tilting it so that all the water moves now vertically or vertically down closer to the building. If you zoom up really close, you can see the pigment kind of moving its way through the water. And it's nice to have that darker edge right by the part of the building. You can also move it left to right, and by that way, you're kind of creating cloud-like formations. You see over here how that looks like a natural cloud because this, in fact, nature kind of created it. You didn't draw that in. That's just water being whiter there and blue there. And then the water got stopped there, probably because there was drier paper. So it's kind of a way to, you just sort of work now with gravity and kind of tilt that back and forth until you find something that seems like not really a subject matter, but it seems more a naturalistic background for the chapel. And then we'll leave that now right there. And while that's setting up now, it'll tend to flatten out more. And then if you end up having waves in your paper, you can always press that out with some books on it. But now we can go and work with our preliminary thing because we've got the basic colors for it now. It's got this darker concrete pour up here in terms of the patina of the actual concrete, and then white everywhere else. A little bit of green in the background and the green for the foreground. And that's all the color of it. Outside, when you come inside, there's in these windows that face south and west, there's a light play as the sun moves across. It hits this depth of this wall, which is skinnier at the top, fatter at the bottom. So all these lights that are moving across a dimensional pattern, not just the skin of the glass, but the little room of space the light comes in here, creates this really orchestral play of light on the interior. And depends on what time of the day. And so it's sort of unusually different every time you visit Ronchamp for a service there, or just as a tourist. There's never two images the same because it's always changing with the language. So he's working with the site, he's working with nature herself and the interplay of design here, and this new, again, sculptural and primitive aspect of modern architecture. So what we'll do is we'll come back to the blue area. We'll start to work with a shadow cast. So we can even work with a bit of the sky now and then come back to our standard blues. Make sure there's a little bit of black in there too. And now I'll see how this sits with our color range so far, because we're going to simply layer this tone in a very sort of transparent wash over the other tones. So you'll see how that would shade away some of the tones if we want to cast shadows onto the grass or the underside of the trees in the background. So that kind of deep, dark blue, pushing toward a blue-black will make it more of a, have two pools. One's got more paint in it, one's got a little bit less. And we'll start with that, see how we like that. So it's also, we're making like a 30% and a 50% view of a tone or the wash on there. So I'll use the middle brush, and I'm going to simply cloak this edge of the architecture, this whole face, because it's not receiving light at all. So it's on our shade side. So I can simply make this over. And the base. There's a little lip of light as this concrete pours out, so we're going to leave that white in there for now. And it's not a real smooth finish concrete out front, so don't worry about it having little pock marks of different color within the paper you're using. It was all the way over this little projecting porch, the modernistic pulpit for the parish priest, the entryway door there. And now we see a little bit of light, which helps us see the sun's projection in the sky around this edge of this rotunded piece on this side. So it's going to come down on an arc to show the movement of the curve of it and hit this little pulpit as well. And we'll see a cast shadow from the pulpit over here and a little sliver of light behind it. So this is all in shade. And then the sun pokes out around the corner. And then we'll do the same thing for this area, yet there is a section on the very top up here, which is receiving direct light on it. So once it curves and go underneath, it's all in shade. So we need to hold on to that arc of the sun striking here. And this will come all the way up, and then it'll move into just a line, a very thin line right by the tip here. So the whole underside is left to be in shade. And again, this is just our 30 to 50% first array. We'll come back to all these areas with more pigment as the drawing progresses. And now we have the whole left side of this one pinnacle piece, which supports the prow of the roof. And then pushing back in here are some panels that open up the light from the exposure as the light moves from the east in the morning. It'll go through these vertical aspects, but right now they're all in shade. So there's a wash that just goes on that whole side all the way down. Then we'll make the interiors that we see through the glass actually very dark in this morning light towards the end of the sketch. Now this is going to be a really light wash because it's all white over here in the back tower, and yet this is a rotunda that's coming towards us and wrapping around to the right. So we can't just leave it all plain of the same white. We have to add some water to our lighter pool, and we're going to take the blue right up to this edge here because it's most brilliant white on this edge, and as it wraps towards us, then it turns into a tone. So we're going to run it up to its top as it runs over here. And then drop that down just a little bit all the way. Because we have to differentiate real white from very close to being real white. And we can fade that out to the sky over here and to the roof line to it. So it's subtle, but it's important to make sure we make that piece three-dimensional too. So there's all our shade sides for this so far. We can come back in now and do the underside of this piece, because basically it's as dark as this tone on the other side. So coating our initial wash over here with our secondary wash will help that be more prominent. So we'll start in our corner again. And now we'll pull out some of our real key shadow elements, which is we're going to come into our initial shade elements and simply add deeper blues and deeper blacks with less water. And we'll check that against our initial shade tone. So we'll see that could be even deeper on top of that one now as you layer that up. So our first key aspect for that is to get a nice bold shadow, the most sort of contrasty thing, because we want this to be the brightest white in the whole piece because that's perpendicular. It's actually canting out, so it's even more perpendicular to the sun here. So this has to really glow down here. So just above it, it's getting a cast shadow from up above. So we're going to take that dark right on that white skin there. That helps that throw there, and all of a sudden it does seem now that this white is probably brighter than that white in the background or this white over here. So that's the most prominent piece for it. Then we put the dark windows in a little bit, it'll make it more pronounced and show the depth of the loan. I'm going to come back to a little bit of a pen work right now to complete this projected box. Now, so simply so we can throw the shadow down to it. So we're going to come back really quickly and show that this comes down on a diagonal. That's a shadow. I'm going to use that same underpinning shadow to kind of detail some of the greenery in the backdrop because we want to push the underside of this foliage back here right against the edge of our white. And then darkest where it hits the base. Then we can sprinkle a little bit. It's not, again, subject, but it gets close enough to the building to have some variety at that edge. Then we'll come back and hit more in there a little bit later. Come over here on the right, do the same thing. Push that edge of the dark green with now the shadow cast onto it, right up against the white. And then down to the lawn area. Now here's a pretty significant piece of lawn, but it's a very small area. So I'm even going to take a pencil and draft it out so I can hold the shape so it doesn't blur out in the grass. And one way to do that, you trace this with ink onto your watercolor paper, and the ink sort of stays on the top of it. If you took a drafting utensil like this triangle and come over here where this side is actually casting a shadow from the sun coming down onto this lawn adjacent to it, if you draft that in and push hard with the lead, it doesn't make a very big mark. What it does, it compresses the fibers of the paper, which it makes it harder for your water or your little small wash to actually move beyond that line. So a good way in the future, if you want to really control a tighter rendered version of watercolor, is to kind of draft the lines down in pencil and push hard with a 6H. And that way you get a little indentation in the fibers of the paper and the water can't move because the fibers are compressed. So we come down here from this point and we show this baseline of a nice cast shadow on the lawn adjacent to it. which is actually a lot of lawn space, but it's up the hill, it's starting to curl around, but that little dark helps set that down for us. And then since we won't see much of a cast shadow from just this little piece, the building starts to cast shadow at this point. So that's just a key base, even though it's less than 1/8 of an inch for the bulk of it, it's an important sort of ground mass for us. And then since we got that kind of worked up, now we'll come back in and kind of detail some of the smaller parts of it as placeholders for now. So we're looking in the interior from this. So that's glazing, so it's much darker on the inside. Because these are the only windows in the building. So when you go inside, it's a cloudy day, it's very dark on the inside. And then we've got a little bit of a slit between these two panels. And then between, there's a twin to this over here, but it's behind this vertical shaft. So it's just right in here, where we'd see a dark element. The doorway. The underside of this. There's a cast shadow from this. It's being lit on only part of it. That gives a little more dimension there. The underside, the cast shadow there. And then this is kind of mid-tone between the white of the wall and the upside. So we'll just simply give it a light gray for now. Now we'll wrap around the other side. All the upsides to these, they're not necessarily sort of like a straight window that punches in. Sometimes they're sort of trapezoidal volumetrically. So you see the underside of the roof coming down for each window, as if these are interior spaces of light coming in. Up here, there's probably darker. And that starts to give a little more dimensionality of how thick that wall is as we move about there. And there's a little bit, even though it's just a detail, it's coming down from the tip here, and it's casting a shadow on the vertical strut. So this comes down and creates a shadow on that area. We'll go back into our corner here and make that a little bit darker anyway. So coming along now, we see this, and now our idea is we're 50% of the way. So we simply go back to what we're doing. We're going to do the same sketch again, just with deeper values to pull things out. So less area with deeper values. So one of the things that happens in terms of the form making is the plan is undulating in triaxial space sort of kinetically. So again, it's this very primitive and sculptural idea. Some people refer to this as modern Baroque in terms of the language of it. So we're going to come into the planes now. We're going to show some of that movement, even though it seems like we know it's just a white wall, but the white wall is moving towards us and up and bowing, sort of an arc of not a pure circle, but something more hyperbolic. And so one of our first washes is going to have a lot of water over here. And we're going to take it from the back side of this white piece, because we have to pull this off of the back now. And we're going to make a dark corner in here. So we're going to put a lot of pigment right where that meets that back wall. Again, it's just a white wall. And then using water, we'll simply pull that off. So it makes this pop out a little bit more in the backdrop. And pushes that wall behind the other. Now that's settled into there. And then use water to kind of bleed it out so it just meshes with the existing wash you had over here. And because it's the light's coming down and bouncing, and even the grass is reflecting some light back up to it, the darkest part of that would be up toward where it meets the roof line. So we can pull that extra pigment up here. And then to help this turn the corner, that same dark will be on this skin because that's actually a shadow from this coming down. So we'll use a little bit less wash, a little bit more pigment. We'll drop a wash down here. And again, we're working on a surface that actually is white. So these are the tones that turn it from white to off-white to grays and blue blacks. Which then means we have to come back up to our roof again and use the same type of definition on the underside of these to pull them off and make them darker. So this might be sort of a broader area where we want to shift to the middle size wedge brush and add a bit more pigment to that. And now we'll come in from its edges and simply redo what we did before to strengthen the depth of that concrete up above. It wraps up here and then turns and rotates up top. And we'll tighten it up by switching brushes here. Get a nice delineation along of our white point. And then the same thing over here. It's going to be much deeper and darker right by this underside and come all the way up to our tip up here to point it against the light of the sky. And then drop it down. You've got a little bit of time to work with because the water is going to set up eventually. So, and we'll chase it on down here. And then let it become a little bit lighter toward the back, a little bit more dominant up here in the front. So again, wash it out with water as you move away from it. The back area. So while that sets up, we'll come back to our vegetation in the back and do another terrace of blue black, maybe even mix some of the old green in there too. And again, edge it right by your white area. Hold it all the way down to the ground. Maybe show some little definition of the vegetation. Strengthen up the cast shadow here on the grass level. So now we've really collected this white and show darks on three sides of it to make that a little more heroic. These are two brilliant whites next to each other, so they're competing a little bit for attention. What we could do is take the least little bit of tone and simply come to this edge now and just make it a little bit darker and then use water to kind of blend it up. And that way it's still powerful up here, but when it comes down there, this white takes over. So you can actually have tones within apparently similar types of whites, and yet you have to identify one's more dominant than the other. Again, our dark value against the base over here as you kind of push this more towards 70% value. And then as it breaks away at the top toward the sky, it just becomes more individual edges. But bring that right up at that point where it meets the white. Maybe right here at that point, it's a little bit important to have that corner turn because that's the closest piece of the architecture to us. So that'll sit that down. And this face probably receives less light than one that's facing to the east. And now we'll push for the deepest dark. So have with more of a dry tone, use your actual pool for shading now. And don't add any water to it, just pigment, and get a deeper black blue to really show the deepest part of the interiors that we have a little bit of a glimpse of. So you may even want to dry out your brush if it's got too much water on it. And then just use the tip of it to absorb some of the pigment to take back into those interior areas. And so one of the bigger windows that shows you the inside is this piece up here. This is where they showcase a statuette of Mary, and it rotates around so it faces out when the priest is delivering a mass to a group of travelers that might come and can't fit inside the church. They'll have an outdoor performance. So Mary faces out, then it pivots for all the interior masses behind it. Back here is the door for the priest to walk out into. These are very dark areas which take us into the interior space. We can go almost like we're drawing in with a pencil or with ink, make those darker. We have one more pigment here. This one darker as well. And you can tighten those up with your ink pen later when you're done if you like. And a little bit here, even though they're a little bit further away now, just the tops of these areas, they might at some point show a little bit of the depth too by dropping some of that in. Come back to the base of the forested area because it keeps casting deeper and deeper shadows on itself all the way down to our grade here. And use that nice blue black that's dry right on that corner too. I mean, the last thing is just to champion the movement of where it's actually darkest on the roof line up here. And that's going to be where this curls in and under. So maybe with a darker wash, a bit more water in it, take it down to the furthest part away from us, which are maybe these crevices, and put your pigment in there and then draw it out with water. So right where this darker roof hits the white of the skin, that needs to go darker as well. And then over here, coming back to the sky, it almost seems like it's a black against the depths of the sky behind it. So now you've laid your pigment down, just simply take water now and push that pigment up towards the top. Make that point more prominent. And then we'll wash this up a bit. Give a place for the water to take it. And we'll do the same on this side. Come all the way down to the base. And it's a matter of knowing that it's all the same tone, it's all in shade, but light is still bouncing around, making some of it brighter than the rest. And so it's going to receive the least amount of light where it actually is on close to the wall itself of the church. There's our pigment, and then we'll simply blend it in, rest, wash it up with water. There we go. You can take a little bit over here next to the sky to make this. It's still the same shadow, but it's moving across, and it's going to seem darker right where it meets the sky level over here. And that kind of brushstroke kind of gives the patina of the rough form concrete on the outside. Again, the inside of the walls that form the church are all the rubble from the previous chapel to still in location. The floor of the chapel isn't flat. When you go inside, the floor of the chapel moves and slopes down the hill the way the hill does towards the altar. So as soon as you come in, you walk around to the backside and come into it, you're still moving within the sculptural piece. So you're sort of part of the performance yourself when you walk through it. Some people refer to as expressionist architecture. That's also a period that happened in the 20th century with very sort of, as the word implies, the idea to be more exotic or pronounced with form making and having the forms move and shift above areas. If you get a little bit of ponding because the paper is moving and settling before it actually flattens out again, you can go back in and kind of push those paints away. Sometimes it's nice when they find a little pocket and it's a little deeper and darker there. Let the water work for your benefit. So that is a 1 hour watercolor sketch, roughly from this vantage point of Notre Dame on high in southeastern France, close to the Swiss border in a town called Ronchamp, 1955 by Le Corbusier.